Hey guys, welcome to Pagan Happy Hour. Happy Friday, everyone. I hope you all had a good week. So today we have a really fun topic that I've been looking forward to. We are going to be talking about the Fae. So we're going to go over some of the terminology, all the different names to the Fae, like the Fairies, the Tuatha Dé Danann, all of this interesting fairy lore, where it comes from, different ways of understanding the Fae, who they are, and we'll also talk a bit about how you can work with the Fae in your own personal pagan practice if you choose to do so. So we have a lot to cover today, and if you are new here, welcome. I do Pagan Happy Hour every Friday at 5 p.m. Central. And if you do enjoy this show, there are two ways to support it. The first way is by becoming a patron. And if you do choose to become a patron, you gain access to the exclusive Discord server full of fellow pagans and witches. And I have the link for that down below. And the other great way you can support the show is through Super Chats, which is the $ button at the bottom of the chat box. And if you choose to donate any amount, I'll see your question or comment pop up really big, and I'll be sure to bring in your thoughts and ideas into the conversation. And as we're going along, I'm going to be looking over here. I'm going to be looking at what you guys are saying, because I really want this to be a two-way discussion. I want to make sure I bring in your thoughts and your ideas about the Fae as well. So now that we got that out of the way, let me cue the drink music and tell me where you're from and what you're drinking tonight. Let's see, I'm just having a simple beer. Let me see where you guys are from. Let's see, I see people chiming in from Colorado, from Vancouver, from Texas, Florida, Georgia, England, San Francisco, Ukraine, Oklahoma, Seattle, Wyoming, Arizona, Texas, Missouri. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for chiming in. And it'll be great to hear from you guys if you happen to be from England or Ireland or Scotland. I'd love to definitely hear your ideas about the Fae. So thank you guys so much for chiming in. I see a couple of you guys are mentioning the different background. That's because I recently sold my desk and my bookcases for my move coming up. So if you haven't yet heard, I'm moving to Savannah, Georgia at the end of the month. So my life is in a bit of a chaotic state right now, but don't worry, I don't think it's going to be affecting Pagan Happy Hour too much. So let's get started, guys. Okay, let me turn off the music. And we will start talking about the Fae. So this is a huge topic. So of course, I'm not going to be able to cover everything today. And do please keep in mind that I am still a novice. I am not an expert when it comes to fairy lore. So be sure to take everything I say with a grain of salt, and to, of course, do your own research as well. So the first thing I want to mention is that when we're talking about the Fae, there's quite a few different terms here. You're probably most familiar with the term fairy, but you may have also heard the Fae. There's other terms as well, such as the fair folk, or the she, or the Tuatha Dé Danann. We'll be getting into those later. So there's a lot of terms here as well, because fairies kind of are a part of the folklore of a variety of different cultures. So you do have Celtic cultures, but you also have Slavic, and then you also have German and French cultures. So this fairy lore really comes from a wide swath of Europe. So keep that in mind too, and that's part of the reason why fairy lore can sometimes be contradictory or include a lot of different types of terminology because it's coming from so many different places and so many different time periods as well. Fairy lore is really unique because it can go all the way back to pagan times, to Celtic paganism, and then still today we still have a lot of fairy lore in our modern day world as well. So it is kind of this interesting line, and of course that lore has changed significantly since pagan times, but it is a great way to gain glimpses into what our ancestors might have believed in and how they might have practiced their faith. Another thing I want to mention too is the label fairy specifically, because this term can mean a lot of different things. Usually when you say fairy, you're referring to like a magical creature that has like a penchant for trickery, perhaps. But it can also be used to describe like even other magical beings, such as like gremlins or goblins are even sometimes called fairies. So it's a pretty diverse term there. And it can also be an adjective. And when it's used in this way, it can just mean magical, like a fairy castle would be a magical castle, or a fairy forest would be a magical forest. Or you even have fairy circle, which is a circle of mushrooms that you sometimes find in the woods, right? So we're referring to these things as having this magical component to them when we use the word fairy as an adjective. It can also just be used as the term to mean the place that these magical beings live in. So the land of the Fae or the land of the fairy. So it can refer to the magical creatures. It can refer to multiple types of magical creatures. It can be an adjective to describe something magical. Fairy tale is another good example of that. Or it can be used to describe a place. So that kind of brings a lot of complexity to what we're talking about when we are going over fairies and the Fae. Another thing is that the look of the Fae have changed considerably over the centuries. Now, when we type in Google image fairy, we probably see usually a girl or a woman that's tiny with wings. But that's actually something that comes from the Victorian era mostly. Historically, fairies did not have wings, but they did have the ability to fly, usually by using their own magical powers, or sometimes in the lore it said they rode on the back of birds. But they didn't really get this connection with wings until the Victorian era, which was a time when there was a resurgence of interest into earlier English and Celtic cultures and different pagan beliefs. So another thing too is that the size of the fairies, while there are some accounts of fairy lore that goes back mentioning tiny little fairies, for the most part, the Fae historically were full-sized. So that's another big change from the way we mostly depict fairies nowadays. And another thing you find historically, that the Fae also had the ability to transform into different animals. So sometimes they didn't always appear humanoid. I think in Scottish lore, it was said that fairy women could transform themselves into the shape of a deer. So different folklore, different cultures had certain animals that their fairies could turn into. So seen a lot of complexity here in terms of the terminology and what fairies or the Fae actually look like. And next, we're going to cover kind of who they are, really, and that's going to be complex as well. So get ready for that, because it really does depend on the time period and the culture. But before we get into who the Fae actually were, let me check your comments and see what you guys have to say so far. Okay. I see several of you in the comments discussing fairy circles. So this is a natural occurrence that you can find in forests sometimes that is a circle of mushrooms. And no one really knows even today why the mushrooms form in that circle, if it has to do with the mycelium under the earth or the spores. But historically, when you found that fairy circle, you wanted to be careful because if you sat inside it, a fairy might present themselves to you. So I mean, if you're trying to find a fairy, then that might be a good thing to do, but you would definitely want to be cautious. But yeah, thank you guys in the comments for explaining the fairy circle lore. I see a question here from Genghis Galahad asking, are the Fae the same as the Fae, as in F-A-E or spelled F-E-Y? So yes, they're basically the same kind of thing, just different ways of spelling, different terms. There are so many versions of what we call these magical creatures. And then Nicole is saying in the comments that she was told that the Fae are dangerous. Yes, we're going to be getting into that later. We're going to talk about some of the specific ways that the Fae are known for their trickery or known to be dangerous. Let me see here. Oh, and another question, are nymphs and fairies the same? We're going to be going over that too. You guys are really bringing in some great questions here. So let me see. So let's talk about who they are. Now, this, again, is going to determine on what culture you're talking about. So there's going to be like 5 or 6 versions of this. So I hope you have a drink ready. So first, let's start with, the Christian tradition, because all the pagan stuff is going to get complicated quickly. But Christianity actually has some lore connected to fairies as well. Interestingly enough, there is a story of how a group of angels were trying to rebel against God, and then God closed the gates of heaven. The angels that were currently remaining in heaven, they stayed as angels. The angels that were down in hell, kind of plotting this coup, became demons. And the creatures or the angels caught in between became fairies. So like everything in paganism, it even kind of blends into a Christian worldview later on after the conversion. So this fairy lore is pretty widespread beyond just the pagan community. Oh, and I see I have a super chat from Peach. Thank you so much for supporting the show. Cheers. So that's the Christian version here. Now I want to shift to pagan concepts of the Fae or fairies and who they are. So the first idea is that the Fae are actually deities. Now this is coming from mostly Ireland, but Celtic paganism kind of as a whole as well. And in this case, we don't say the Fae or fairies, we call them the Tuatha Dé Danann. And I do hope I'm not butchering that pronunciation too much. I apologize if I am. But even though we would conceptualize the Tuatha Dé Danann as deities, in the mythology, they were more viewed as a supernatural race of people. So while they were kind of worshipped as deities, they themselves weren't necessarily like gods. They were considered just people that had these extreme powers or abilities. Now, these are the main deities of pre-Christian Ireland. So when you read about Celtic mythology, these names of the gods are most likely considered to be part of this race of supernatural people called the Tuatha Dé Danann. So do please keep that in mind. Now, another thing to consider is that it does change over time because in Celtic paganism, they didn't really write anything down, as we've discussed before in many episodes of Pagan Happy Hour. So when we're learning about them now, we're reading sources that have been written after the Christianization of Ireland. And in that case, their terminology starts to shift, where they are no longer called the Tuatha Dé Danann and start to be called Fairies or the Fae. And then from there, it trickles into the general folklore of the population. Now, the Tuatha Dé Danann were definitely considered to be like gods and goddesses in ancient Ireland. There is a whole cosmology and origin story behind the Tuatha Dé Danann. Some stories speak of them as coming from islands in the north. Some speak of them as coming from the sky. And they were said to have participated in a series of battles. A first set of battles with other supernatural beings, which the Tuatha Dé Danann lost that battle. But then even worse, they lost an additional battle with the people who would become the citizens of modern day Ireland, so the average humans. So they kind of faded out because of the fact that they lost these battles. And because they were considered more of like a supernatural human race, they were able to die, right? Which makes them kind of unique. Similarly, when we look at Norse paganism and Celtic paganism, I do find it interesting that the gods can actually die, which is something you don't necessarily see in other pagan cultures. So after they kind of lost these great battles, they retreated to the fairy mounds. And these are burial mounds that are also called the Sidhe. Now that's spelled like Sidhe, I think. These fairy mounds are really kind of a burial chamber. So they kind of retreated to these mounds, and then Sidhe actually became another term used for the Fae, or these beings that were once considered gods in ancient Ireland. Let me see what you guys have to say about that. Now, another thing is that after Christianity really fully took over, they lost their prominence even more. And so there's a belief that this was kind of a process of the Christianization of the Celtic world. They once had these great pagan deities, the Tuatha Dé Danann, who over time, as the world Christianized, their power, their role in society became more and more diminished to the point that they were no longer viewed as deities, but were instead viewed as mischievous magical creatures, the Fae. So that's a really interesting theory, and I like that idea. To me, it seems to make sense that it would have kind of gone through that interesting transition. The Irish people never fully gave up their pagan beliefs, but they shifted from looking at these creatures as deities to kind of a much lesser known creature. Let me see what you guys have to say about that. Oh, I have a super chat from Jess. Thank you so much. That has a question here saying, do you plan on doing more Hellenism videos? So yes, I definitely do plan on doing some more videos on Hellenism. I did a Pagan Happy Hour on Hellenism recently, and then I also spoke a lot about Hellenism in my Pagan Happy Hour episodes about pagan prayer. So I definitely recommend checking those out if you haven't seen those yet. But I do love the Greek gods, so I do plan on making more content on Hellenism in the future for sure. Thank you again for that super chat. Let's see. Luca is asking about the Fae. Aren't they also referred to as the Aoshi? Yes. So AOS space SI. And then I've heard multiple variations, but I've also heard you can pronounce that as the she as well, or the Aushi. This whole Celtic pronunciation thing is really throwing me for a loop. I've seen so much conflicting information trying to figure out how to pronounce these terms correctly. But yes, Luca, in the comments, you are right. That is another term you can use for the Fae. Let's see. Great questions, guys. Let's see. Okay. So let's see. So that's kind of the first way of looking at the Fae as deities, as the Tuatha Dé Danann, that eventually kind of became these lesser beings that we now call fairies or the Fae. Now, another way to look at the Fae as spirits of the dead. And this comes into being because there is quite a lot of crossover in Celtic folklore, in stories about the Fae and stories about ghosts. And also, like I mentioned before, when we look at these burial mounds, the Irish called them the She, which is a term that kind of also correlates to fairy or fae. So there's a lot of crossover here between death and the fae, or ghosts and the fae. Both ghosts and the fae were considered as living underground, which really kind of goes against a lot of our modern conceptions of fairies as these little creatures that live in the woods, where when you look at the Irish folklore, most of these stories mention the Fae living underground, which again kind of makes sense on how you would even have other spiritual creatures like goblins and gnomes sometimes being called fairies as well, because those would also be creatures that kind of lived underground. And that kind of makes sense when you think about the veil between the worlds, right? When you're actually physically going underground to a space, you are kind of entering into this new realm. And if the Fae live in this supernatural place, then the underground world kind of fits well with that. Now, there is another kind of interesting creature, the Banshee, in Irish lore that you may have heard of. And that term, the Banshee, basically means a woman of the fairy mound, right? So the Banshee is usually described as a female ghost, but here we're using the word she in the name. So there's a lot of crossover here between the dead, ghosts, and the Fae. There's even some fairy lore stories of people who, when they look at the Fae, they don't see the Fae, they see a deceased relative or something like that. So there's a lot of kind of interesting crossover here. Oh, and we have another super chat from Vocatus. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your support. So yeah, we're already kind of getting into a lot of different ways to approach the concept of the Fae. So we went over the Fae as deities, the crossover between ghosts and the Fae. Now, to make things even more complex and interesting, you can also look at the Fae as a prehistoric precursor to humans. So this is a theory that most people don't necessarily believe nowadays, but was very popular like a century ago. And some people definitely still kind of abide by this. But it's a theory that our fairy folklore evolved as a kind of folk memory we have from a prehistoric time or a prehistoric race. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but one of the common beliefs on a way that you can deter fairies is with iron. So where does that come from? Where does this idea that fairies don't like iron come from? So it was believed that the Fae were this prehistoric race that existed before humans, and they were conquered by iron. This prehistoric race did not have access to iron. They weren't living in the Iron Age. They just had, stone and wood and bone. So the Fae were conquered by iron. And this fits in pretty well with the stories we know of the Tuatha Dé Danann and the great battles that they went through. The first battle was with supernatural entities, but that secondary battle was with humans. So these two theories kind of fit in very nicely. So this idea of the Fae not liking iron comes from this belief that the Fae were actually this earlier version of humans that had these powers that were then killed in these series of battles by a more advanced civilization that would later become the, us, us Homo sapiens, something like that. So that's another way to look at it. Let me see here. Oh, I see an interesting comment from Alva that says, my understanding is that after they lost the battle to the Irish, they retreated to the otherworld or the underworld, and that the She or the burial mounds are portals between worlds rather than the actual place where they live. Ooh, I really like that idea. And I think that makes a lot of sense with the concept of the fairy mounds being portals. Now, we do see burial mounds in so many pagan societies, especially in Celtic paganism and Norse paganism. So they are really important to a wide variety of pagan cultures. And they are often viewed as places where the veil is at its thinnest. Let's see. Okay. Great comments, guys. Let me see. So then another way you can look at the Fae is looking at them as a nature spirit or an elemental spirit. You might have heard the term elementals if you study any other kind of occult practices, or maybe even if you are into Wicca, you might have heard this term. So this idea comes from the alchemist Paracelsus, who was a pretty famous alchemist. And he kind of classified 4 categories of supernatural beings based on the elements. So we're talking the 4 classical elements of earth, air, fire, water. So you have gnomes for earth, you have undines, which is a kind of water creature for water, salamanders for fire. You actually see a lot of salamanders in the wand suit in tarot, which is associated with fire. So, and of course you see it in a lot of alchemical artwork as representing fire. And then finally, for air, you have sylphs. Now, that is another term that does have a lot of crossover with fairies and sylphs. So sometimes the fairies are kind of viewed as just this spirit of nature, both representing air and having the power over the element of air. So that is kind of a neat concept, and I like that idea as well too, in viewing the Fae as representing kind of this element of air. Oh, we have another super chat here from Stephanie. Thank you so much. That says, I have an entire notebook on all your teachings. Please don't ever stop doing this. I may have missed this, but do you believe in the Fae? So thank you so much. I appreciate your super chat. And the question, do I believe in the Fae? I do think there is a lot of mystery still left in the world. I do think that the modern concept of fairies as small creatures with wings, I don't necessarily believe that, but I do believe in perhaps mystical spiritual beings, especially in areas that have a lot of sacred energy, like these burial mounds. So I do maybe believe in the more historical version that there could actually be these spiritual beings that are very ancient, but I wouldn't view them as looking like historical or looking like kind of more modern interpretations with like little wings. Though I would love that. I would love to, to see that. But of course, let me know in the comments if you have had any fairy experiences. I have watched some people on YouTube talk about experiences where they've interacted with the Fae. Let me see. So just checking your comments here. Let's see. Okay, great. Yeah, I see some of you mentioning that this concept of elementals is pretty common in Wicca and high magic. Yeah, definitely, because there's a whole lot of kind of elemental aspects to ceremonial magic as well as Wicca. So another thing too on this fairies as nature spirits concept, I wanted to bring up the Green Man, mostly because I saw the movie that just came out, The Green Knight. Last Friday, right after Pagan Happy Hour, I headed to the theater, and I highly recommend this movie because there are so many fascinating pagan references in it. If you're unfamiliar, it's the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The Green Knight is basically the Green Man, which is a very common spirit / deity that you'll find in pagan lore. I do have a whole video on the Green Man that I linked down below. And the way they interpreted the Green Man in this movie was very interesting. So I highly recommend going to see it. In the movie, if you're familiar with the story of the Holly King and the Oak King, you're going to see a lot of interesting stuff, because in the beginning, when the Green Man or the Green Knight walks into the round table, he throws down a branch of holly, signifying he has just defeated the Holly King, won the battle, and it is now his time to reign over the world. So you could even look at a spiritual figure like the Green Man as kind of a representation of the Fae, or a nature spirit in that way. So definitely check that out. Or, if you are just interested in fairy lore, you should probably, go ahead and read a lot of King Arthur stuff. Le Morte d'Arthur or The Once and Future King. I have those linked below, are great places to start, because there is a ton of fairy lore intermixed within the King Arthur legends. Of course, you have Morgan Le Fay, and then, Le Fay means fairy. King Arthur was crowned in the fairy kingdom. After he dies, he gets taken to Avalon, which is basically a fairy kingdom. So there's a whole lot of fairy lore in the King Arthur tales. But just wanted to mention that, because it's always fun when you go see a movie that's like full of pagan references. And I haven't seen a movie that was super pagan like that since Midsummer, which was a horror movie a couple years ago. So now we've kind of talked about these different ways to look at the Fae and understand where they came from. So to recap, we have the Fae as deities, as the Tuatha Dé Danann. We have the Fae as spirits of the dead. We have the Fae as kind of a prehistoric precursor race to humans. And then we have the Fae as a nature spirit or an elemental. Now I want to talk a bit about what you'll find in fairy lore and how people interact with the Fae. And usually it doesn't go well, I must say. The Fae are known to be tricksters. There are different categories of the Fae. It's funny, in Scottish fairy lore, there's two categories of the Fae. One category is just, playing harmless pranks on people, or just kind of tricksters. But then the other category is like evil and will destroy you. But in general, the Fae aren't usually portrayed as nice creatures to interact with. Now, most of the stuff we have nowadays about the Fae and how people interacted with them is written about protective charms, because if the Fae were known for trickery, were known for kind of this darker version of magic, people wanted to protect themselves from the Fae. So you'll find a lot of protection charms. One uses iron. Of course, that's going back to that theory of the Fae representing a prehistoric race that lost the battle to the Iron Age peoples. So that's one way to create a protective charm. And then there's also accounts of using St. John's wort, which is a type of herb, or even four-leaf clovers to protect yourself from fairies. Now, if you want to draw fairies to you, you can use rowan branches. Rowan is a tree that was considered very sacred to the Fae, but you probably want to be careful with that. Let me see. I see a super chat from Boris mentioning that his wife mentioned that around every full moon, it was believed that the fairies could come out and take you into their world. Yeah, there's a lot of crossover between fairy lore and lore about the witches as well, right? That idea of during the full moon, the veil is thin and magical beings can cross over, or you can even cross over into that realm. So yeah, you do definitely find that in fairy lore. Let's see. So you definitely have this whole catalog of protection charms that were used to ward against the Fae. Now, sometimes people left offerings for the Fae, and this primarily occurs on Beltane and Samhain. So Beltane and Samhain are two of the four traditional Celtic main holidays that were celebrated. So with these two holidays, Beltane and Samhain, it is believed that those are the two main days where the veil is at its thinnest. And it also represents the transition into the new season. So in ancient Celtic Ireland, they didn't really view us having 4 seasons. It was more like 2 seasons, as in light and dark, or summer and winter. So Samhain marks the start of the winter half of the year, and Beltane marks the start of the summer half of the year. And those 2 points were viewed as times when the Fae were able to cross over. So I do have a video about Samhain and how people kind of viewed the Fae during Samhain that I linked down below. But one of the things that people did is they left offerings for the Fae, usually in the form of like milk and honey or bread. The bread thing is confusing because in some cultures, bread deters fairies, and in some cultures, bread attracts them or is used as offerings. But at least in most Celtic cultures, they would leave some type of like bread or milk and honey out for the Fae so that they wouldn't be disturbed by them during these times when the veil was at its thinnest. There's even a fun theory that the reason people started wearing costumes or masks during Samhain was a way to make themselves look like the Fae so they could pass by unseen. So I love that idea as well, and the concept that the reason we still wear costumes today is so that, we're kind of tricking the Fae, into not seeing us as humans, but as seeing us as one of them. So yeah, that's another great thing you can do if you do want to work with the Fae, not necessarily, try and get them away from you, but you want to be cautious. Just leaving an offering is a great thing to do. And there are many accounts of people who have left offerings. For Beltane, you have the bannock cake, which is like an oat cake. In Scottish history, especially, they used a lot of these. You would toss it into the great Beltane bonfires, and you would do that as an offering, or you might even sprinkle some on the ground or throw it into the forest for the Fae. And I do have plenty of videos about Beltane and Samhain you can check out if you're interested in learning more about those 2 pagan holidays. So you have kind of these main ways that people interacted with the Fae, as either creating protection charms or as leaving offerings. Now, there are lots of accounts of various forms of fairy trickery, which is why people wanted to create protection charms and talismans in the first place. The first great fear was of changelings. So a changeling is someone who's baby, they believe that their baby was taken and then a fairy baby was put in its place. And sometimes it would be a child, but usually like a baby or a young child. This is kind of interesting when you think about it in kind of a mundane terms, because you wonder if, why they thought that their child was suddenly taken and an exact replica was put by the Fae in its place. I read a theory that a lot of people think this is because of developmental disorders. So if one day, your child is just fine, and then the next day they're exhibiting signs of like autism or some type of developmental disorder, people would think that, oh, it was the Fae. The Fae took my child and replaced it with a different child. That was a really interesting theory. So really any type of sudden change in the child or even sudden disease that came about, it was believed that that child was no longer human, but was now a changeling, was now part of the Fae. And unfortunately for that child, it wasn't good news. They would be ostracized from the community. They might be like left in the woods. So that is definitely a large part of the fears around the Fae, that they would kidnap and take children. Let me see. Just checking your comments here. Let's see. Okay, great. So another thing that the Fae are known to do is make you get lost when you are walking, mostly in the woods, but even I've heard fairy lore of people in towns and villages getting lost. And one of the ways that the Fae try and lead you down a wrong path is using the will of the wisp, which is this kind of bright light that you might see when you're walking down a path, and it's so beautiful and it kind of hypnotizes you when you just start walking in that direction. You do see Will of the Wisp in Disney's movie Brave, if you've seen that one. And one of the deterrents of having this happen to you was to wear your clothes inside out, which is really funny. I wasn't able to find out where that comes from or how wearing your clothes inside out could actually help you, in any way. But that idea of the Fae leading you astray, getting lost, maybe even leading you into their realm where at that point you're fully captured, is common to a lot of different fairy lore. And this is something that's not just tied to fairies. The idea of getting lost in the woods or kind of some magical being or creature making it so that you can't find your way home, that is common to many different cultures, many different time periods, even modern like movies like The Blair Witch play into those fears, right? So that's kind of a neat thing that's about the Fae. Let me know if you know where this whole like wearing your clothes backwards when you're walking in the woods comes from, because I would love to know where that idea came from. Oh, I see a question here from Genghis Galahad asking, are swamp lights the same as fairy lights or St. Elmo's fire phenomena? It's possible that the will of the wisp that is mentioned in folklore is actually these swamp lights that you can see. In that case, it makes it slightly less fun because it's no longer magical. It's more like just this weird scientific thing. But yeah, that's definitely possible for sure. Let me see here. Okay, let's see. Lynn Smith has a thought on the clothing idea, wearing the clothing backwards, possibly because they can't stand things that are not in good order. That's possible. Let me see here. Yeah, I like that idea. I mean, that's definitely a good way to think about it. So in general, when you look at kind of books written by pagan authors, a lot of them might have spells for attracting the Fae or instructions for making little fairy doors or little fairy garden. And, while that can be fine, it's just good to understand that historically and in the lore, the vast majority of stories about the Fae show them as kind of trickster or even, dark entities that you probably don't want to run into. So you definitely want to be cautious if you are wanting to work with the Fae, because, most of the stories don't end well for those that do interact with them. There is a really fun book that I read last year. It's fiction, but it's kind of based in a lot of accurate lore, I would say. It's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. That's a really good book that delves into the English fairy lore, but actually looks at the fairies in this more historical perspective, not as tiny winged creatures, but as full-sized, kind of supernatural human/ghost looking entities that tend to lead people astray and cause chaos. So that book has one of my favorite depictions of the Fae, because it is very much based on kind of a more historical view of who the Fae were, what they looked like in all of the lore. And of course, if you are looking for resources on seeing more depictions of the Fae that aren't just modern ideas, definitely, again, look into King Arthur stories, Le Morte d'Arthur, or The Once and Future King. Midsummer Night's Dream, of course, by Shakespeare. That's a good one to read. There's a poem, I think, from the 1500s called The Fairy Queen. It's a very long epic poem, so I recommend reading that too. So it's good to look at a variety of different sources from different time periods and cultures to get a more well-rounded understanding of who the Fae are, because it is so diverse among cultures, and it's changed so much since we kind of romanticized the idea of fairies. Starting in the Victorian era is really when that took off. So definitely keep that in mind. Now, we do have about 10 minutes left, so I'm here for any questions you guys have about the Fae or other aspects of paganism, since I went through everything I wanted to make sure I covered today. So let me know what questions you have about the Fae, or really anything else associated with paganism. Let's see. Let's see, just checking your comments here. Oh, I see. Someone mentioned the story of Cinderella, which is, of course, another very popular fairy tale featuring a fairy, the fairy godmother. I love how we use the term fairy tale, right? It's just right there in the story. You're going to get a lot of good magic when you're reading a fairy tale. Let's see. Oh, this is interesting. Someone in the comments, let's see, Thunderstorm, says that he was told by older people that the elves, fae, fairies judge people by their honor. That's an interesting idea. I've also heard the theory that you're never supposed to say thank you to the fae, which is weird. I don't know where that comes from. I've read that in multiple sources, that you're never supposed to say thank you to them. I don't know why that is, but I like the idea that the Fae kind of judge you based on your honorable nature. Mm-hmm. Let's see, some more questions here. Gabriella is asking, is it true that the goddess Bridget was taken by the Catholic Church and turned into a saint? Yes, so Saint Bridget, who is celebrated in Catholic tradition during Candlemas, is actually the Celtic fire goddess Bridget. So yeah, they basically just took a Celtic goddess and then turned her into a saint. Imbolc is the main pagan holiday where we honor Bridget. Let me see here. Sarah has a super chat. Thank you so much. She asks what my thoughts on Maleficent are, or as a variation of the Fae. So I actually haven't seen the movie Maleficent with Angelina Jolie. It's on my list. I definitely have to see that. But when you look at Maleficent as this kind of darker version of a fairy, it makes sense, right? And she's actually like full-sized, right? So that's also very accurate. So yeah, I mean, I think she would be engaging in activities that the Fae were known to do, very tricky stuff. So yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate description of the Fae. Oh, and we have a super chat from Teresa. Thank you very much. That says, thank you for prepping for these happy hours and spending time with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys spending your Friday evenings with me. It's really fun. I love hearing all of your thoughts and ideas too, because I learned so much from you guys. Let's see. Oh, I see in the comments here, Kevin has a theory on this whole concept of not saying thank you to the fairies. He says that it comes from trying to scare people away from even acknowledging the Fae. That's an interesting idea. I like that theory. Let me see what else you guys have to say. Oh, here's an interesting comment from Callie that says, I've heard that you don't mimic sounds in the forest since the Fae may take offense and steal you away. That's interesting. I haven't heard that one yet. Let's see. And Elva is mentioning in Scottish folklore how it has those two different sections of Fae. You have the Seelie, which is the benevolent fairies, still kind of tricksters. And then you have the Unseelie court, which are the more malevolent ones. Yeah, so that's kind of neat about the Scottish version of the Fae. Let's see. Checking your comments here. Let's see. Gigi has an interesting question. What do you think about veiling in paganism? So I know some people actually choose to wear a veil that are pagans. Now, that kind of depends on what branch of paganism you're following and what role you see yourself as having, because when you look at Greco-Roman forms of paganism, yes, the priestesses did often veil their hair. But if you're not, working with the Greek or the Roman gods, to me, it doesn't really make as much sense. Also, those people were, professional priestesses. And we don't have any professional priestesses or priests in modern day society. So I think of it more as like a personal choice. If you want to, you can. But we don't really have the same setup that they had back in the day where you had the profession of being a priestess, and you would wear the veil in the temple as part of that. But, I know some people do it. So, if you want to do it, that's totally fine. There's no rules in paganism. Let's see. Checking all your comments here. It's moving so quick. Let's see. Oh, and Sarah sent another super chat. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I actually just got the Disney streaming, so I definitely need to watch Maleficent. You're right about that. Definitely need to see that. Let me see. Great comments and questions, guys. Oh, okay. An interesting thought here from Damatis23 about the idea of not saying thank you to the fairies. She says, I believe thank you is perceived as kind of just shallow, so you want to put more effort into your appreciation. Probably like giving an offering instead of just saying thank you, which fits in well when you think about the importance of offerings in pagan religion, right? Because offerings were hugely important and the main way that people interacted with deities. So if you just said thank you, probably be a lot better to leave an offering, right? Let's see. Great comments and questions, guys. I really appreciate all your thoughts here. Let's see. Okay, so I should probably sign off at this point. I really want to thank you guys so much for sharing your Friday with me, for having this discussion on the Fae. I feel like we only scratched the surface. There's so much more here, but I didn't want to bore you to death by like reading out different parts of the lore or going over too much of the primary source material. But I do have a bunch of links down below if you are interested in reading more about the Fae. I have a couple videos that I've linked down below that mention the Fae and different ways you can leave offerings for them and things like that. So again, thank you guys so much. This was a really fun chat. I really appreciate you guys, especially those of you that did Super Chat or those of you that are my patrons. Thank you so much. I wouldn't be able to do what I do without you guys. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you next Friday. Bye.